Romance at a glance. Romance at a glance.
What you say now?
Romance at a glance.
Go ahead, girl. Hello and welcome to Authors at a Glance. This is your host, Shawnee, and with me, as always, is my great co-host, Bridget. How you doing, Bridget?
I am doing so great. Today we are interviewing romance author Evie Dunmore.
She's the author of such romance books as
Bringing Down the Duke, her debut novel.
And A Rogue of One's Own, the second book in the series, just released.
You guys, Evie was a goddamn delight. We had so much fun reading her book this season on the podcast. And Evie and her publisher are kind enough to give away a copy of A Rogue of One's Own to one of our dear listeners. So this giveaway will close on Saturday, October 10th. You can enter on our website at romanceataglance.com/Evie-Dunmore or head to Instagram, Romance at a Glance, and click the link in our bio. You guys, this is a super easy one to enter. You just have to sign a quick Google form and bam! You are entered to a chance to get a free copy of A Rogue of One's Own.
Romance besties, listen, I have to just say this before we get into this interview because, oh my God.
It's got to be said.
Evie Dunmore, smoke show. Like, no lie, no joke. Hand over my firstborn child. She is so hot.
Hot as sin.
Totally a sin.
She is a snack and a half. She's gorgeous. Honestly, she is a stunning person.
Yeah. Like, she probably rolls out of bed
so
stunning.
Beautiful. So beautiful. And me and Shawnee showed up on this Google Hangout, you guys. We were ready. We had our questions. We were excited. We liked her book a lot. We were really excited to talk to her. The interview was great. I'm so excited to, for you guys to hear her thoughtful answers. And she turned on her camera and I was like, oh, what it is.
I was like, I should have put on pants today.
Bye. Yeah, Shawnee goes, hold on, Bridget, I got to turn my camera off. I don't have pants on. When we were setting up. So you guys, despite our less than groomed appearances, because here in Los Angeles, we haven't left the house in fucking forever. And despite her astoundingly beautiful appearance, we had a great time.
We had a great time.
We had a great time. She even asked us how we got together. So if you guys have yet to hear the story of how Shawnee and I started this podcast, make sure you stick around till the end.
Yeah, she had such great energy, and like, I could talk to her about so many different things other than romance. That's how I felt after the interview. Like,
yeah. And when we get to Berlin, we're going to be going for cocktails.
Oh, yeah. When I go to Berlin, I'm like, Evie, what's up? Coming over.
What's up?
Let's take me out.
What's up?
Cocktails. What are we doing?
Take me out.
Let's hop on these new trains.
What are we doing? Okay, guys, make sure you enter the giveaway and get yourself a copy of A Rogue of One's Own. And without further ado,
here is our interview with Evie Dunmore.
Hi, Evie. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Bridget. This is my co-host, Shawnee.
Hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello,
we are super happy to have you talking about historical romance. So to preface this, Shawnee is a massive fan of historical romances.
And I am Bridget's Sherpa through this historical season that we're doing right now. I have picked like all the books and they're all recommended from like our Instagram listeners. So it's really exciting.
All right.
Yeah. So we were super excited to find out about your book and choose it for season 4. And we had a blast reading it. I know you just said you listened to the podcast, but we had so much fun reading it. Sometimes it could be a little, if there's not a back catalog of work to read through when we're choosing a book, we're like, I don't know, should we choose it or not? Because we never read it ahead of time. And we were so pleased by how great your book was.
Thank you.
I think this was my first and only 5-star rated book this entire podcast. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Yeah. Are you a historical romance fan? Is that your genre, or did you just really find a story in that?
I'm definitely a historical romance fan. So I've been reading historical romance for years before I wrote my own. I'm not even sure it's possible to write historical romance without actually liking the genre and reading it. So, yeah, I'm a fan.
Who are some of your go-to historical authors?
Lisa Kleypas works for me almost every time. And I love Joanna Bourne. I don't hear her name as often, but I think she's just a brilliant writer. And, I love how she writes in third person point of view, but I'm always right there with her characters because she goes so deep. So that's really awesome. And I also really like Mimi Matthews. I've discovered her recently because she writes Victorian historicals, and they're super well researched and just so like wholesome. so those are ones I'd recommend too. Yeah.
So wait a minute. When you say wholesome, do you mean? Let me just clarify. Uh-huh. Does this mean closed door romances?
Oh, right. Well, incidentally, they are more closed door, but it's just what I meant was that there's a warmth to their stories that just feel like really, I was about to say eating warm bowl of porridge, but it doesn't sound very romantic, does it? So it's just like really, maybe cozy is a better word. Yeah.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Like you have maybe like a cup of tea, you got a nice little biscuit, you're dipping it in, you're in your cozy jams with a nice blanket. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, so I want everyone to know that Shawnee woke up extra early today. I'm very proud of her because Evie is in Europe. Are you in Germany, right?
Yes, I am.
So due to the time zone difference between LA and Germany, I want everyone to be very proud of Shawnee and her extra effort.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for doing this because, I get asked to do virtual author chats at like 8 p.m. EST. And I'm usually like, yeah, I can do that. But it's like 2 a.m. here in the morning.
Yeah.
I can just watch my eyes go smaller and smaller on the screen, and my answers aren't that coherent anymore at some point. So I really appreciate that we're doing it this way this time. Thank you.
Oh, Bridget is definitely making fun of me because she does she'll say to me like, "Oh, Shawnee, let's meet early," and I'm like, "Okay, 11 noon. What's?" And she's like, "I have small children." But Germany is one of my favorite places. I would move to Berlin actually in a heartbeat if I could. So that's awesome that you're over there in Germany.
Have you been to Berlin then?
I have my mom went to, all of my aunts went to Berlin at some point in their life in the 70s, 80s. And so it's just like a place that's like close to my heart. So I went last year. Thank God, before all of this happened. And I loved it. I was so in love with the city. If somebody said tomorrow, hey, here's all the resources you need to move to Berlin, I'd be like, deuces, I will see y'all later. Yeah.
You liked it. It's an awesome city.
I also loved Berlin when I was there. We went, my sister studied abroad there in Germany. And so we went for a few weeks. And I've been back a couple times. I went to the World Cup there. I'm one of those people. I came for the whole time. We drove around the whole country, went to 5 games. It was unbelievable. I loved it so much. It's so fun. All right, but you're not from Germany. You're from, Are you from the UK or where are you from?
No, I'm German Lebanese.
Because we had seen Scotland somewhere and we were like, okay, we want to know where you're from. And first of all, Highlanders in general are my catnip. I think they are probably the historical book I've read the most of, growing up. Don't ask me why. But so when I saw that, I was like, I'm so intrigued. I need to know more.
Well, you might like my third novel then, because the hero is a Highlander.
Oh, yes.
Going up to Scotland as well. And I love Scotland. I lived in the UK for 4 years, and I was always up in Scotland because I'm a hobby mountaineer. So the highest mountains you can find in Britain are in Scotland. And anyway, it's just an amazing place. It's got a very special magic to it, I think. And I've traveled quite a bit, but Scotland is the place where I'd always go back to. It's just so, I don't know, but it's a place that actually looks really good in some, fog and rain, and it just adds to the experience. And the people are super friendly, and you have the right of way, and you can do some wild camping in places, and it's just. I would have gone this year had it not been for COVID. So I poured it all into my third book.
It does feel like Scotland, there could be a mystery unraveling around any corner. Like it feels like once the fog lifts, like if you saw little elves or fairies, you'd be like, of course. I mean, not even, I wouldn't have to stretch the imagination at all. You're just right around the bend. Like I feel like anything there is possible. And I also think Scottish and Irish, I think it's weird, not weird, but like interesting that like I don't feel this way about English boys, but Scottish boys or Irish boys, the twinkle in the eye, they all have it. Old, young, everyone's got the twinkle. And you're like, oh, that mischievous man is going to lead me into some fun. I can just tell.
Oh, maybe. I've met a few twinkling eyes, but
Well, the third book is going to be Hattie's book, right?
yes, it's going to be Hattie's book.
Okay, I'm super excited because Hattie, I just thought her outlook and the way she would describe things was so funny in the first book. She was like, yeah, but why would that even happen? Because she's like so much wealth, but also not a lady, so she gets more freedom. And she was a very refreshing character. Really enjoyed her.
Yeah, she was fun to write because she's totally unlike me. So I was like digging deep to put her to life on the page. It was, yeah. I wonder how it worked out. I liked her a lot. It was a lot of fun. Certainly, it was, I think, the least challenging book to write out of the three. But I also paired her with like the darkest character out of all of them.
Ooh.
So it's an interesting dynamic between the two, and yeah, I really look forward to sharing them with readers.
I'm like very intrigued by this because like I do love a dark character. We're actually thinking of doing a season of dark romances in general. But in historical, we were talking about how, like on the podcast, how I like historicals better than contemporary, mostly because, well, one, I started in historical, so it's like my first love, but two, you can get away with so much more in historical, right? So in contemporary, if the guy was like overbearing, we were like, what's with that? Like that, you know, but in historical, if the guy's overbearing, it's like, well, that was the times. That's just what it was. Like, you know what I mean? Or like brooding and this and that. You can like kind of gloss away some of these like character flaws or play with them in a different way because it was a different time. So you get to just accept that these were the times and then enjoy like whatever that is. Whereas like in contemporary, there's so many social issues that hit you in a different way than they did in historical.
Well, but they still seem to sell really well. I mean, if you look at 50 Shades, I think it sold 90 million copies by now. So I guess at the end of the day, people aren't too bothered. If you look at the sales figures that speak for themselves, right? So
they do, but everybody calls it like a guilty pleasure. It's not like people don't feel outwardly proud to say like, oh, I love 50 Shades of Grey necessarily. I mean, some people do.
Beyonce did like the soundtrack for it, didn't she? And I mean, they get 3 blockbuster movies out of it, and it's still selling. I mean, I totally hear what you're saying. I'm playing a bit of a, like with this right now because sometimes what people say and then what they buy and actually like is two different things. I feel.
Oh, absolutely. Because we just 365 on Netflix. I don't know if you've watched it.
I saw it around and I was like, this looks so bad, it could be good. I'm not sure yet, but I'm intrigued at some point. But some people said just, skip the story and look at the mashup of all them sexy bits. They said, so I don't know.
I skimmed it. Because I wanted to watch it with Bridget. When I kept hearing it online, and it wasn't romance people who were talking about this. This is just regular people on TikTok. Don't ask me why I was on TikTok, but I was. And everybody's like, have you watched 365? Film yourself watching the movie or pieces of the movie. And I had no idea it was a romance novel. I just clicked on it and was like, oh, let's go down this rabbit hole. And very quickly I realized, oh, this is a dark romance. And all of these women and people online love it. And they're not even like romance readers or listeners. It's because everybody likes that bit of, that feeling. And nobody wants to admit that they love that dark kind of menacing romance. Like this is, what this is type of feeling. But I will say that from what I skimmed of it, that the movie is not, it's cheesy, but it's not as cheesy as you'd think. Okay. And the actors committed to their roles. And I think that's the key that makes it not that bad. Like, not, you know what I mean? Because I think if the actors feel like they're doing a cheesy thing and the actors are terrible, then the whole thing just becomes one big cheesy mess. But I do think that it's good enough to like enjoy, and especially like if you're with your homegirl or somebody to watch it, I think you'll dig it.
All right. You're selling it to me. Yeah. No,
do you feel like there's like, have you had any interest in your books to be converted into TV or film? Since now, like, the Bridgertons is going to start on Netflix soon. And me and Shani are always flabbergasted that more authors' stuff isn't getting optioned. Because like you said, like 50 Shades made more than $1 billion. You know, like Twilight, those movies and books made more than $1 billion. I'm like, catch on, people. Women and men love to read and watch romance.
Well, I think there's there's some practical challenges with optioning historicals, and that is because the production of historicals is just really expensive. And Julia Quinn obviously has a massive fan base, and she's got a long backlist. So I think there was if I were a TV producer or a movie producer, I could look at the figures and say, well, that makes sense to try that, you know. But if you have like unknown authors or authors with a smaller following, which is the case in historicals, then you have to put in a lot of effort for the costumes and the background and teaching people the dances and the manners. And then it becomes a massive cost outlay. And you don't know if anyone's going to watch it or if they just prefer to rewatch Pride and Prejudice or the new Emma. It's a risk. But of course, I'd be absolutely thrilled if somebody wanted to put the early suffrage movement mashed up with some romance onto TV. So I'd love that. But actually, at the moment, I'm just really happy with how the books are going. So, did you have an agent ahead of time and then work with them to sell the book, or did you just send it out to publishers? How did you get to your publisher? No, so if you apply to one of the big 5 publishing houses, you need an author because an agent. It's not even 2 a.m. and I'm already not talking straight. So you need an agent if you want to get to one of the big publishers and you want to have a trade paperback or mass market version of your book, because I think they only accept unagented manuscripts for digital. And so what I did is I wrote Duke and I finished it. Then I looked at it and decided I'm going to give this a shot. And then I started to look for an agent. And after I'd found the agent, she sold a 3-book deal to Berkeley. So that's how it went.
That's amazing. But you're doing 4 books, or are you only doing 3?
No, it started out with 3. And then the first book did well. So Berkeley said, we want to buy more books. So now I can write 4 for the series, and a 5th one, which might be the beginning of a new series or a standalone, or a 5th one in the series that is currently, on. We will see.
Cool. So, congratulations. That's amazing.
Congrats. Yeah. So then my question is, when you first were doing the series, or when you first did the first book, did you already know what was going to happen, like up to a certain amount of books, or like how does that work for you?
So when I did the first book, I had a vague idea for Lucy's and Tristan's story, because as I was writing the first book, I thought the next character I would like to write about was Hattie. But then Tristan Valentine popped up at the ball and bringing down the Duke, and I thought, actually, I think Lucy is going to have her story next. So I didn't really know what was happening. It came from Tristan's appearance in the first book. I got a plot idea for the second book, and then as I was writing the second, Hattie's love interest popped up. So I got a vague idea for the third book. So I'm basically just playing it by ear as I write. What I always had in mind was that the theme across the books, be it 3 or 4, was that all the girls, in their own way, were going to work towards amending the Married Women's Property Act because they are suffragists, and amending that act was like one of their main priorities in the 1880s. Yeah, so that's the thing that ties the books together.
Yeah, I really liked, because Shawnee hasn't read the second book, but I got an ARC of it and read it. And I won't spoil it for everyone since you guys should all go buy it. But I really liked the way that you resolved Lucy and Tristan, because I was very worried, because I think a lot of authors would have been tempted to throw aside her suffragette cares for the sake of a happy ending, like a quote unquote traditional happy ending. And that's all I'll say. I won't spoil it, but I was very, very pleased when I got to the end of the book that it did not happen that way.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I considered it for a moment, and Lucy was like, "No, not gonna happen for me." So I thought, all right, I leave it alone. I'll think of something else. She was very insistent. Yeah.
It's very interesting to me. The fact that you made suffragettes so appealing is, it to me, like a feat in itself. Because Bridget and I have read books that have a lot of social issues in them, and they don't work really well in romance, mostly because you're reading to escape. And so when you have a lot of social issues in your book, it's like, you're like, I don't want to deal with that. Yes, I know that exists, but between these pages, I want to walk into, like, someplace else where, women are not oppressed and we're not, like, like, for me, I don't like to read things that have, like, slaves in it, or former slaves, or like, stuff like that. So for me, when I first saw that it was suffragettes, I was a little bit like, uh-oh. And the fact that it was done so well, and outside of the podcast, I think I've had the most amount of conversations with people about your book, because they'll listen to the episode, and then we're talking suffragettes, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this book has, like, fostered so much conversation for me. So, like, just well done on that. Like, it was cool that it was there was a social issue, but it wasn't something that became, like, for me, like a preachy thing. It was really something that enhanced the story, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And so I'm wondering, okay, so I guess maybe pre-COVID, but how do you actually write, in terms of, like, do you write at home? Do you go out? Can you write amongst people? Are you like an introvert who's, like, always who, like, writes in, like, a nook in your house? Do you have, like, a set time every day that you write? We're always very interested in seeing how people, like, kind of their thoughts and get to writing.
Well, I'm very introverted, so I tend to sit in a nook and not move much. And yeah, so but in general, I think the process for the books was different, because the first book I wrote a bit in my own time at first, and I was still coming to grips with writing for hours at a time. So sometimes I just go out to a coffee shop here in Berlin and just sit and write. And I liked that there was a bit of buzz in the background. For the second book, it was a massive struggle, because it was a second book, and second book syndrome is real. At least it was for me. So I actually came to a point where I had to go to my mom's place and take a week at a time at her place and just sit there and write. And she just put food next to my laptop 3 times a day and was like, keep going. I'm like, okay. So that was the second book process. And the third one, well, because there was COVID, that was very interesting. So I was with my partner during the lockdown, of course, and there's 2 kids, small ones. So navigating around that during the lockdown was very interesting too. So I was basically hiding, and he kept, my back free. So it was different processes. And as for, fixed times, no, I get up and then I start. But I'm a night owl, so you'll probably find me writing at like 1 a.m. in the morning rather than at 9 a.m. in the morning. Yeah.
That's Shani.
So I call those. Go ahead. Oh, okay.
I was just gonna say I wake up in the morning and I've gotten all this like cool stuff from Shani, and then I like weed through it while she's asleep, and she wakes up and has like 40 different messages for me. What about this? What about this? What about this?
Well, I have this theory that like the night is empath hours. So people who are like energy sensitive, the whole world goes to sleep. Yes. And now you can breathe. Your energy can just permeate the space and you just fly. I find like in the middle of the night, I just fly through things that would have taken me 3 and 4 times as long in the day to do. I don't know if that's like how you feel, but that's just how it works for me.
No, I very much feel like that. I never thought about it in terms of, being energy sensitive. But of course, as an introvert, you're super energy sensitive, when it comes to other people being around you and being buzzy and wanting stuff. And it's like, oh, okay. And at night, everything's quiet and calm. And my brain is just more alert. It's just how it works. I feel like a lot of writers are actually night owls compared to non-writers from what I've seen. Yeah.
Do you did you have another profession and then now you were writing full time? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, I had another profession. I still have it, though it's a bit dormant at the moment because I'm focusing on 3 different books at the same time, and there's COVID, so not much going on that front at the moment. But yeah, I'm a business consultant with a focus on automotive, so absolutely nothing to do with romance, but I work for myself, and that's how I managed to write the first book. I was working for years and years, just head down working and reading romance during my commutes to unwind. And when Annabelle and Sebastian from Bringing Down the Dew came to me and kept buzzing around in my head, one day I decided, you've worked for so many years without taking a break. You're going to give these 2 lovebirds a shot now. And so I started to, phase out the consulting a bit, did a writing course at the same time, and then started writing. And then for the last 3 or 4 months of Duke, I stopped taking projects altogether and just finished the story.
That's awesome. So
I work for myself also, consulting and writing and doing stuff. So it is a really nice flexibility to be like, I'm just not going to take any clients this month. And I also have 2 small children who are this fall will turn 3 and 1. Wow. And so with COVID, I was like, I'm just not going to take any real clients for the summer because we may never leave our houses in LA ever again. So it has been a really nice flexibility, that is for sure. So you know what I miss though, is that commute time that you were talking about. When I lived in Chicago, I would read usually romance or sci-fi and fantasy. And I had about 30 minutes to an hour, both directions every day. Mm-hmm. And during lunch, I would read it was such a nice transition. And that's one thing that's a little tougher, obviously, with kids in general, but working from home, I don't get that let me just read for 30, 40 minutes, because then that'll turn into 3 hours. And then I just don't do anything.
I don't understand how you can read for 30 minutes. The way my brain works is that as soon as I pick up that book, I'm in it for hours and hours. It may feel like 30 minutes, and then I'll look at the clock and 4 hours has gone by. Or I'm listening to the audio. I lay down, listen to it, and I'm in it. And I'm thinking I've only been here for 20 minutes and it's definitely been 2 hours. So 30 minutes to me would feel kind of in toddler time. 30 minutes is why are you interrupting me? I just this is what I just only read 2 pages. What? Oh wait, no, I didn't. That was 30 minutes. I don't know. It just, my brain registers that time so differently.
It's just because you get to your bus stop and you're like, oh, that's my stop. And you close your book and you walk into work. You just get used to it. Because I agree now, that I like to just crush a whole book in a sitting. I'm like, why? I don't need to eat I have this book to read. Thank you. But yeah, you just get used to it. Like and you have a natural endpoint, which is like the train arrives, the bus arrives, and now you're at work and you have to go work because that's what you're getting paid for.
Don't you feel grumpy when you get pulled out of the story if it's a good thing?
Oh yeah,
like good point. Yeah,
yeah. Or like I don't know if you do this or used to do this, obviously pre-COVID, but I would get off the train or bus and then I would stand on the platform, like if I'm in a really good scene or finishing a chapter, and I'm just standing there finishing my chapter, or I'm walking and reading down the street, yeah.
I get like I love how you're like a little bit grumpy, and I'm like, no, I hit a rage point. Like if somebody comes and interrupts me while I'm in a deep, like any sort of deep train of thought, it doesn't have to be even reading. I can be working at the computer or doing something else. I later found that this is actually a thing. This is a sensory issue for
it's a hyperfocus.
It's a hyperfocus. So
hyperfocus,
yeah. And when I'm in hyperfocus, if anybody interrupts me, I will kill their firstborn child. Like it's it's like an intense rage. It's not just like come on. It's like, what do you want?
No. My mom used to punish me when I was a kid by taking my books away when I was in the middle of a book, because she knew that was the one thing that would really get to me. And I was so hyper-focused as a child on reading that I'd take the book to dinner with me and try to read while I was eating and stuff like that. It was really extreme. There's pictures of me at birthday parties for kids where disturbed parents took pictures of me sitting in the middle of kids going like, yay! And Joelle's sitting there reading a book she hadn't seen on her friend's bookshelf before. So it was a bit abnormal. And so my mom would actually snatch my books and said like, no more reading time. And I was, rage is the right word. it was so, it's like you're on a journey, you're in the middle of it, and then it's just, I don't know, your whole world gets taken away.
It feels like you're dangling on the edge of the cliff with no relief, and then you're just left there,
Yeah, totally. But then when you're grown up and you've got like competing, how do you say, bids for your attention, like your family or work, then you need to, I needed to learn to regulate that. But I totally remember the feeling.
I think my mom will be happy to hear that she was not the only mom who had to punish her children by stealing books. And we had a firm no books at the table, and me, my brother and sister would try to be reading under the table, but like eating, like, oh no, we're not reading, we're just eating. And she'd be like, books, and everyone had to give away their books. And it was like, and then you'd find out that like, if I was reading a book with my dad, for instance, he'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to take the book so you don't stay up late and read it with a flashlight. And then the next day you'd find it and he had already read through another third, and the betrayal was the cut was so deep. Oh my God.
I just found out from my mom that, like, because Bridget knows I tell a lot of stories on the podcast, but my mom was strict, okay? And she was definitely very heavy-handed. And I always said to her, like, spankings never worked for me. You should have just took my books. That would have really killed me, And she told me as an adult very recently, she's like, I didn't take your books because you love them so much. She's like, I didn't want you to, like, have, like, this kind of punishment feeling when it came to reading. So she's like, I never took them. And I was like, you know what? As many complaints as I have, thank you. Thank you, Mom.
Yeah. It's very wise.
So I'm wondering, like, when you're building your character, how do you go about building like a protagonist that can be fallen in love with? And are you pulling from real life? Are you pulling from movies, books? Like, where are you finding your thoughts, ideas? Or is it just like a download? Like it just comes to you?
Yeah, I think I pulled it mainly from my subconsciousness, I would say, because I just felt the characters. They were in my head, and I didn't really know where they came from. So there must have been bits of me. I'm not saying I'm like them, but
which character do you think you are the most like?
Probably a little bit like Sebastian.
That's such a good answer.
Well, it's he's not very good at communicating emotions and a bit, type A and introverted, and so he goes about it all very logically, and then it doesn't work. He can't deal. So I think that reminds me of me sometimes. Yes, I'm not a duke though. It would be nice, but no.
Exactly. I mean, that's the reason I asked you specifically if you downloaded, because as we're talking, I'm like, a lot of the things you say remind me of just empathic things, right? So like one of the things, as for me, like I'm an empath, a lot of ideas or things you get are just like these downloads to your brain. You can't attribute them to anything specifically. It's just like you get it and then it's there. And then I don't know if this happens for you, but it will sit at the forefront of your brain until you get it on paper, or until like you just have to physically get it off your brain in order to have peace.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why I started to dial back on my day job was because I'd be writing client emails or a PowerPoint presentation, and the characters would really start up, and I had to, just to be physically comfortable, I had to start writing down the dialogues that I was hearing or describe what I was seeing. And it wasn't, it wasn't very professional. So I was like, okay, I have to make some choices here. And as you say, it was like a physical sensation of needing to get it out, because they were like, well, it sounds creepy, but they were kind of scratching at the inside of my skin. And I was so preoccupied that I was also making a terrible partner or friend, because I'd be at the table with people and just zone out and focus on what was going on inside my head. So it was very good to have the opportunity to actually have an outlet, because I think a lot of people want to write and have these sort of urges, and then don't find a way of making space for that, or don't allow themselves to make space for that. And it's probably very healthy to be able to let it out.
Absolutely. I have a question, because all of, obviously, your characters are different, the main female protagonists. What do you feel like when you're writing the sex scenes, it comes with the character in the download, or do you feel like it's some, like you said, like a small piece of you that's like, a thought that maybe you'd never want to explore in your real life, but you're like, oh, maybe if I was with the Duke and he pushed me into a dark corner in this ballroom, this is what I would say. Like, how does that come up?
No, I would say that so far I haven't written anything that I. It's difficult to say. It's
because me and Shani are here for some sex. We're here for some smutty goodness.
Yes, absolutely.
We're here for really good stories. That's like our main thing. Plus, we want the door to be open so that we can be there with the couple.
Yeah. So what I can say is I feel like that my novels are progressively becoming more open or explicit on that front, because it's a learning process for me too as a writer. And I think, sex can be the place where you're most vulnerable in your daily life as well. So, that could be a place where a lot of, emotions that have nothing to do with it are coming to the surface all of a sudden, because you become so, so open or so vulnerable to something. And for me, it's similar to when I'm writing the books. These scenes are kind of delicate scenes to write. And I'm still gaining confidence as a writer too. So I have to do two things. I have to be in this vulnerable place to write it. And at the same time, I have to completely delete the fact in my head that my editor is going to read this. Which, you have to develop a thick skin, at least I do. And I feel like I'm learning this. And I realize, I notice that I'm becoming much more adventurous. So I'm interested in seeing where that's going. Certainly, I have a novella on my mind that's going to be nothing like the tamer Duke and Rose. So I wonder if I'm going to actually write it, but I'd like to.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes. If you guys are wondering, because you cannot see her face, she just gave us a very cheeky smile and a giggle. So that sounds like a novella, right? up our alley.
It's interesting that you say that because, like, I mean, I grew up very prudish in a very prudish, home. And now on the podcast, we talk so openly about sex. But when we first started the podcast, I definitely had to get over this like hurdle of being like, I'm going to talk about sex, fantasies, what we want to see in books, like everything that's in my brain, which I feel like is the most vulnerable to tell people about, your kinks and, like all those things on a podcast. And I think it was slightly easier because it was a podcast and nobody could see my face in the process of talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
But after season 1, I felt like the more you talk about sex, just the more open you get about sex. And then the more people write you about their fantasies and the things they're doing, you're like, oh, I'm not the only weirdo. All right, great. We're all in this, so it became easier. And now we say anal all the time. So
I think that's actually one of the beautiful things about romance as a genre is that it allows people to explore different types of love and types of sex and types of romance, different pairings, different, menages, all kinds of different things, be it in historicals, which has some separation from your normal life. So it gives you a little bit of protection around something that might be too you wouldn't maybe say in your real life to a friend, oh, I really would want to be whisked into a cloakroom and ravished. But reading a historical, you might read it and be like, oh, wait, I do want that. Or maybe you read it and you're like, oh, that's wonderful for that character. I think it's sexy, but I don't want that. So I think that's one of the most fun things about romance is it allows people to see other things.
Yeah, and I think that kind of circles back to what you said in the beginning, that like Shawnee said, she likes historicals because people get away with a bad behavior more, or what we now would consider bad behavior. I think it depends on that what role literature or books play in your life, right? Do you see it as a behavioral guide for proper behavior, or something that's going to should be shaping a perfect conduct in the daily life you want? Or do you see it as a place where people go to actually secondhand live through experiences, and it's like a cathartic experience and a place where you can do things that you wouldn't do in real life, but because you're an adult person, you kind of know the difference. So, and it's still something you'd want to explore and something where you can subconsciously learn about yourself. I mean, I know enough people who, through romance novels, became more in touch with, maybe their desire or came up with new ideas. And say about 50 Shades, whatever you want. But I mean, I think for a lot of people, it was like, ooh, maybe you should try this. And who knows? Maybe they ended up taking that away from the books with them, and it's now enriched their lives. So who are we to say what should be read or written? Certainly, as you say, romance can be a good place to explore that. And there's so many subgenres in romance too. If you label it a dark romance, people probably know going in what's in there. Probably comes down to expectation management, really, right? If you label something really fun and frothy and then it suddenly turns into, something else, then it could be jarring. But I'm personally all for writing everything and then allowing people to go into that if they want.
Actually, I have a question. I have a question about the fun and frothy.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have the same question, Bridget, but so we're wondering about the cartoon cover of your book. Because so we found that there's a lot of more illustrated covers like this in romance now, and we are assuming that maybe it's because it makes the book more accessible to a wider audience or whatever. But we're curious as to why specifically you wanted a animated cover or an illustrated cover versus something else. Well,
authors don't really get asked what type of cover they want, especially not if they're like a tiny fish showing up.
First-time authors,
No, we get given a cover, and I was surprised when I saw my cover for the first time. And
did you think it was going to have people on it, like non-character, like real people?
Well, no, I thought I was going to get a woman in a beautiful dress, and then it was a blue horse. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. And to be honest, it really grew on me. I mean, I gradually really fell in love with the covers, and I certainly loved the second cover at first glance. You know, I was like, oh, this is perfect, because I had gotten so used to it. It wasn't strange or different anymore to me, and I could just appreciate the art in it and the colors and how it had picked like such a good scene from the book. But certainly seeing it the first time on a historical for me was a huge surprise. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was surprised. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I will say is that, you know, because we're on Instagram all the time, and to Shani's point about marketing, the book covers are beautiful. Like you said, the colors pop, the scenes are very fun. And I see a lot of people posting pictures of the book or having it in their stacks because it is such a beautiful, it's just such a, I mean, it is beautiful art. We were talking about on the podcast that the one thing that we struggle with illustrated covers is, to me, reading that into that cover, I'm thinking fun, flirty, jaunt. I'm not thinking that it's going to have any weight to it, I guess. And when we read your book, we were pleasantly surprised that it had a real depth and range, and it wasn't, not that we don't enjoy a fun, flirty romp, because we do, but we were just surprised that it felt like the cover didn't necessarily match the guts. And it's always fun to find out, like, I mean, marketing departments are selling books and they're doing a good job selling your book because you got more books in your book deal. So they're doing their job, but it's always interesting to see how it all pans out.
I think it's what she was talking about earlier about managing expectation, right? So like generally the book cover lets you know what you're getting in for. And so right now I'm like, oh, you know what? I've had a heavy week. I want something I want a book that's light. I don't want to think too much, you know, that sort of thing. So when you pick up a book thinking that it's going to be light, and then you read Suffragettes, you're like, wait a minute, I didn't have the mental capacity this week for that specific book. It's just a management of expectations, I think, in the book covers or whatnot.
I know, yeah, for sure. And I was skeptical going in with that because of the whole expectation management. But what we see is, or what I see is, certainly there are people who, you know, don't like it, but the majority of people seem to have enjoyed it. I don't know if the cover, you know, I don't know if the book keeps finding readers by word of mouth because people say, don't look at the cover, but the content is kind of fun. I don't know. Or if people just keep going for it and actually liking it, because the majority of people seem to have enjoyed Duke. And that to me is a proof that it kind of worked. I don't know how, but it did. So,
well,
I actually like the second book better too. So readers, I have not released this review yet because I was supposed to last week when the book came out, but you guys know me, I am not on top of my reviewing on time, except for this podcast. And I liked it better than book one, which I also liked.
I've heard that from a lot of people actually, though, who came back to me with feedback. I mean, you know, they said, I like this better than the first, and I already liked the first one. So again, not sure how it happened, but I'm quite happy that it did.
You know, it's to the credit of the illustrated book cover. This we definitely talked about on the podcast. When I was a kid, I used to have to sneak romance novels. I was not allowed to read them whatsoever in my house. It was seen as very illicit pornography to read a romance novel, just FYI. Some of them were kind of, but so I used to take, I don't know if you ever did this, but did you ever have to cover your books in school? Like your textbooks, like paper cover them? Okay, so I used to paper cover my romance novels, and then I'd write Pride and Prejudice like on the cover of it, you know, or like The Great Gatsby, or like, you know, or whatever. And then my mom never asked me, like she never was like, let me see that book or whatever. So that was the way I could get away with reading romance novels in front of my mom without her knowing what was going on. And so, like, to the credit of the illustrated cover, because they look so fun and not like too much is happening there. You can read them anywhere without feeling ashamed. Some people, like, I didn't like to read them like I wouldn't read them on the bus. I would always cover them because I don't want people to know I was reading romance going on the bus to school or that sort of thing. So like I was very ashamed of it. It was not something I was like out and proud of back then. So like that would have been a good cover for me at that time.
I think I read somewhere that when Kindle or when e-readers became a thing, romance novel sales skyrocketed by 800% in the first month.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I believe it.
So, and that's actually surprising because if you look at older romance novel covers, they were not always the half-naked guy with the lady in the dress. For example, the Julie Garwood covers or even old Lisa Kleypas covers, they have like a pond and a swan or a bunch of flowers. So romance novel covers have always had this evolution, I would say. And it seems to be going in cycles, from being completely innocuous and you have no idea what's in there. Okay, so there's flowers. Great. Maybe they're symbolic for something and I just don't know. But and then you go and it becomes very sexy. And then now it seems to, in some, in some genres or subgenres, it seems to cycle back to something less, romantic, obviously romantic. So I'm not sure how it works, but it would be really interesting to look at different cycles of romance novel covers over time, I think.
It's actually a good idea. We should write that down, Bridget.
I was just thinking, write that down, Shani. That's a good idea. I do think it's interesting too about the sales of it because I find, it'd be interesting to hear what your family thinks, but my family, my mom, my sister, and me, we've always read romance novels. My dad has always known that we've read romance novels. He doesn't read romance novels, but he reads a ton of sci-fi and fantasy, and he'll read like Anne Rice. So he'll read mysteries. They always in mysteries have a romance. Like it's not a romance novel, it's a mystery, but it is. I mean, like it has romance, And so we've never had any sort of I wasn't like Shani. I carried my naked males on the cover of my book and walked down the street with pride. But I'm always interested to see like just your, when you started writing and it became clear that you were writing a romance novel, what did your like family and friends think?
Well, first I didn't really tell anyone that I was writing in the first place, kind of to protect my writing as well. Because, so both Germans and Lebanese are very pragmatic people when it comes to jobs. So as a Lebanese person, you can be like a doctor or an engineer, and everything beyond that is odd. And I think the Germans are kind of the same, be a doctor or an engineer. So saying that I started to write romance and was like phasing out my day job for a while was certainly wouldn't have found a lot of, support. Also, I thought, because when I started to tell my mom about it, she was quite excited about it. She said, well, you've been writing since you were 7 years old. It's good that you're giving it, a shot now. And my grandma was very supportive too. And once the book was published, I felt the Lebanese family was supportive too, because now there was a priest and a writer in the family, which is good.
Jackpot.
Yeah.
So I only listen to audiobooks. Bridget reads the actual book, and it's honestly, I've lost the ability to read. This is kind of crazy, but when I went back to read, I think season 2 or something, we actually read a physical book, and I hadn't really picked up a physical book in so long. I'm a multitasker of many things, and I called Bridget. I was like, Bridget, I can't read. I've been trying to read like the same page for a really long time. And my eyes just wouldn't track like in order to be able to like read and enjoy a book like I used to, just devouring a book. And so that was a thing that we discovered last season when we had to read a book. Actually, Bridget's sister came in and like co-hosted that episode so that I wouldn't have to read the book. Oh, But anyway, I live in audio. I love audio. I produced audiobooks. And I'm curious to know more about how your audiobooks are getting made. What do you have a say in the narrator? Like how much say do you have? Is it kind of like the book covers where they're like, hey, this is, you get what you get and you don't get upset. Like, how do you feel about how the audiobooks came out in that regard?
So, confession time, I haven't listened to my audiobooks. I find it really terrible to hear my own words read back at me. I have a very hard time reading to people from my books. That's hard enough. But actually hearing somebody else read it out loud is physically uncomfortable for me, so I can't do it. But I heard that a lot of people really enjoyed the narrator. And I did have a say in picking her. I heard some, like Penguin Random House suggested Elizabeth Disicky, and I heard some samples of her reading other work, and I thought she had a lovely accent and voice. So I thought I liked that. And what they do is they ask me how I want certain things pronounced. So I had a say in that. And certainly I was asked if I wanted to continue with the same reader for the second book. And I felt it made sense to have continuity in a series. So I said, yes, let's go with her again.
I think continuity in a series, just for whatever my opinion's worth, is important. When narrators keep changing in a series, I don't know why. I just greatly dislike it. Also, like, even if the narrator is like not the greatest narrator, sometimes when the narrators change, they give an old character that you already have a voice for a different voice, and you're kind of like, there's a disconnect that happens in a series. So I think it's always a good choice unless the first narrator was extremely terrible, to like kind of stick with.
Well, I didn't really hear a majority of people say that it was terrible. So I felt quite confident.
I became an audiobook producer specifically because I read a book, or I listened to a book on Audible that was so terrible. Like, I'm like, just the audio quality alone sounded like somebody took their iPhone like headphone, recorded a voice memo of a book, and then put it up on Audible. And I was like, how did this make it? Like, where was the quality control? How did this make it? So I went down this rabbit hole of figuring out how books get on Audible and that sort of thing. And I was like, oh, I can do this, and way better because like I produce music. So like, I was like, I have all the equipment for this. Let's figure this out. And then it was just like a rabbit hole from there. But so there's definitely been some like narrators that I was just like, oh, this is not good. But then if you have a great narrator, it makes the book sing like insanely crazy. Like there's a few narrators in romance that keep coming up over and over again. There's one narrator, Christian something, who comes up in dark romances all the time. He has a great voice for dark romance. And Stephen Fry, who does Harry Potter, but he's also like part of the what's the British the Holy Grail, Monty Python, The Quest for the Holy Grail. He's an actor in that. He does Harry Potter's. And
Stephen Fry is like a British icon. He's amazing. Yeah. He's just so good.
He's so good. His voice is butter. Yeah. I'm like, Stephen, read me anything. Read me anything. Read my phone book.
I would listen to him. I would actually listen to him reading the phone book. And I'm not an I'm not an
auditory
person. Yeah, I have a very hard time listening to things and then I wouldn't say retaining information, but I just don't see anything when I hear something, you know. And when I read, it's completely different. Like I read a line and I have an image in my head, and I'm starting to go into it. And I hadn't understood for a long time that it's not the same for everyone. I didn't realize there were different types of processing information and, building worlds in your head. So, but Stephen Fry, I'd listen to him, definitely. Watch him too. He's hilarious. Yeah.
Are you a paperback, hardback, or e-reader, or just anything you can get your hands on?
I like paperbacks and e-reader. I think hardcover is great to look at, but they're not very comfortable for carrying around and also take up a lot of space. So I'd go with mass market or a trade paperback. And if you read romance, you probably read it a lot. So getting it for an e-reader is also very much like saving shelf space. So yeah, it's a mix.
Yeah, I finally broke down when we started the podcast. My husband's been trying to get me to buy an e-reader since we met 6 years ago. he's been like, let me just buy you one for your birthday. But I just love the like physical feeling of holding the book open, knowing exactly how much is left because I can feel the pages, like the smell of it. There's just something about it that, like you said, like I'm like in that world and I see it all happening. And I don't quite get that same love of it when I'm doing the e-reader. But I did break down, and I have consumed, especially during COVID, the libraries in LA were closed for months. The bookstores were all closed. So like I've read an enormous amount of ebooks this year, and for vacations and stuff, when you're, I'd bring like 8 hardcovers or 8 paperbacks, and he's like, what are you doing? Just buy an e-reader.
Yeah, and what you said about, exactly how much is left, I think that's really important, because sometimes you're reading a story on a Kindle and you're like, awesome, I've got 20% left. And then it's over. And it's like, it came out of nowhere, because those 20% were actually like 15% of that was something else going on in the Kindle, and just completely different, how do you say?
Notes from the author or excerpt from another book.
Other books,
that just happened to me the other day. I was so excited. I was like, ooh, 20% left? Like, we must have another sex scene. There must be a really romantic gesture. And it ended 10 pages later, and I was devastated. I was like, how dare you?
Yeah. Let down on the last meter.
I love how it's like those last pages are like the hope. Like that they are like a physical representation of hope.
And of just
when a book is like not got to where you need it to be, and you're like, oh, I have this much left of hope.
I also do it based on like, should I finish this book before I go to sleep, or should I stay awake? And it's like, if I see a paperback and I look at it, I'm like, that's way too much to read before I go to sleep. But for some reason on the Kindle, I'm like, 30%. I could read that before sleep. It's like 2.5 hours.
True.
Okay. I'm curious also to know. So like Bridget and I work before we did this podcast, majority in film and visuals, and a lot of post-production as well. And we find that the editing process is where you actually find the story. You can shoot whatever you're going to shoot, but when you sit down for editing, that's where the real magic comes, when you are creating a thing. So we're curious to know, like, what are you finding in the editing process versus like your first draft or your first or second draft of your books?
Okay, so I have to say that my writing process is well, first of all, I'm a plotter. I'm a pretty hardcore plotter. So I don't really write myself into dead ends, and I don't explore much on the page. I have the challenge of putting what's in my head onto the page. That's my main challenge, because I keep building it all in my head and then not writing it, which isn't great, because obviously it needs to be written. And stuff happens when I write as well. But what I'm trying to say is, I don't have a lot of, like, not a lot lands on the cutting floor. Is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay.
The cutting room floor.
So,
yeah.
Exactly. So my first draft reads probably very differently from, let's say, a Mad Panther's first draft. So I take a really, really, really long time to write a first draft, but it probably skips a couple of stages. So under the line, the time that goes into the book is probably the same as for a Panther. But it means that my books so far come back with very few edits every time. And I think what I can do is, so for me, the magic for the editing comes in that I haven't seen the book for 4 weeks, and when it comes back and I have a fresh eye. So I can see better where to sharpen, something, where to add a scene to really make it pop, and also where to maybe cut bits that are redundant. And I'm not sick of it anymore. And that really helps, because I look at it with a new loving eye and to have maybe some ideas in the meantime. But when I'm writing, I never take a break from the manuscript. And you can become really, or I can become really caught up in it and not like a single thing about it anymore, or not even see where I should go. So for me, the biggest boon when it comes back is I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. I have corroborated with my editor where I feel uncertain. she maybe has 2 or 3 ideas, and then we discuss those. And so it definitely becomes a lot better after editing. But so far, it hasn't happened to me that I send off a draft and it comes back and it becomes a completely different or substantially altered thing afterwards. Yeah.
Nice. We call that in music demoitis. When you make demoitis is when you make a demo of a song. So you write a song. It's your first draft of the song. It just might be scratch vocals so you can get the idea down, and then you listen to it over and over and over and over again because you're trying to get ideas. And then when you re-record it, you're like, I don't like this re-record, because you're so like locked into the sound of the demo. So generally, if you put the song down like for a month or 2 months or whatever someone may need, you come back, you're like, oh, this demo is terrible. What was I thinking? This is not. So you're not attached to that thing anymore, and you can like objectively look at it and make the changes you need to make. So that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm really lucky with my editor in that I feel like I feel like she really gets my characters. So we haven't really had any, sometimes I hear from authors who are really distressed because they need to rewrite a book or something. And I mean, it might happen to me too if I keep writing, but so far I felt like we've always worked together rather than against each other in any way. And that's super helpful. Yeah.
Nice. So okay. So as an introvert, one introvert to another, and definitely as somebody, from what you're talking about, I definitely get the sense that you have energy dollars, right? Which is like, you can only spend so much energy before you're like, I need to go back to my cave and be away from people. So when you are writing, you're writing, but what is it like to be writing a book and then also having to promote it? And you got to be social, you got to do panels, you have to do podcast interviews, you got, how is that working for you, just like in a general sense?
Well, chatting to you now is really lovely because, it's the 2 of you and it's really interesting. And so that's really nice. But certainly the whole promotion thing doesn't come very naturally. I didn't really have social media before I started writing. And then everyone told me, if you want to be an author and, have books out in the States, you need to be on Twitter and on Instagram. You need an author Facebook page. And, have you thought about Pinterest? And then there's BookBub. And I was like, great. So when am I going to write books? And it's, I think, something a lot of authors struggle with. So I left Twitter like a month or something ago because COVID just made me doom scroll, and I had to write a bonus wedding chapter that I promised my readers for my newsletter, and I wasn't making any headway on that wedding chapter at all. I wasn't really writing on my 4th book, which is Katrina's story. I was just getting distracted, so I thought, this can't be, this can't be right. You can't have these type of activities interfere with the actual art. So I think for my own creativity, it's better if I'm not out there too much, and I'm not absorbing all these things that are going on in the world. And also I think it shortens my attention span when there's so much happening. And when you write, or when I write, I really need to think long thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, girl. Yes.
we think the same. When we started, everyone was like, oh, your podcast has to have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these other things. And I was like, Shani, I can't commit to running all of those different things. And so we were like, we're only going to do Instagram. We have Twitter. It's linked to our Instagram. So all of our Instagrams go to Twitter. I very occasionally log into Twitter and will like reply to people, but like once a week. I'm very not committed to Twitter. And Facebook, all of our posts automatically go there, but I only log on to Facebook if someone has written us a note. I don't go because, like you said, it's like first of all, it's too much to keep up with. And Twitter, especially for me, like Facebook or Instagram, I scroll through because I comment on a lot of people's photos and interact with a lot of people. But it's easier for me to like stop. But I feel like Twitter, like I could all of a sudden lose 2 hours because there's so like the rabbit holes are so deep. And like the scandals in Romance Landia that you see on Twitter, people get so irate about things. And some of them they should, rightly so. I'm not against them getting upset. I'm just saying for me personally, like I can't manage all of the other creative things that we're pushing forward and engage in that all the time.
Yeah, that's for me. It's like during quarantine when it first started, I downloaded TikTok like everybody else did. And also all like everyone in my family got Animal Crossing, which is like a video game, but you can play with each other. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can connect through the internet. So my whole family had a Discord chat and we would play together and that sort of thing. The problem I had with it is that like, so, you know, I guess the way I process is a part of ADHD for women. And so all these little things create dopamine like drops, you know. So I'm getting like excited about TikTok, every new video, and then next thing I know, it's the morning, and I've spent the entire night on TikTok. I deleted it from my phone because I said, this is intense. Like I can't just sit here and spend all my night scrolling and never know where the time went. Like I'm in a hyper focus. And same thing with Animal Crossing. I would play it, and to the point where I'd wake up with anxiety going, oh, I have to go fix my island. And then I remember one day going, if something that's supposed to be fun is giving you anxiety about getting something done, you have to put it down. And I just like cold turkey put it down. I was like, I'm not playing this. I'm not doing this. And then I'm so excited to talk to you because I feel like get to talk to someone whose brain is similar to mine, operates in that idea of like the long thought. You allowing yourself to just get lost in a long series of thoughts. And if anybody ever saw where the thought started and where it ended, it would look like some crazy wonderland. Yeah. But those long thoughts are where the creativity comes out. And when I put down Animal Crossing and when I put down TikTok, I shot 2 music videos, full concept music videos, and was able to let my thoughts and emotions over what I was going through and what I was processing really manifest in a creative way without kind of blocking it with these short bursts of dopamine. And so I understand what you mean in terms of just like getting off of social media and not being a part of it. Luckily I have Bridget, because Bridget, she understands my crazy brain and she helps me. She reminds me sometimes like, Shani, we're doing this thing and like, this is what's happening. I'm like, oh, okay. You know? And so I feel less bad. Sometimes you feel bad about the way your brain works because like, I think that sometimes people don't understand that you can get lost for hours in a thought, or you can be sitting in a group of people and be in a faraway land that, you know, and somebody's like, you know, and you're like, what? Like, what were we talking about? I'm sorry. And I've just gotten to the habit of saying, hey, I wasn't paying attention. Can you repeat that? I just say that all the time now because 9 times out of 10, I'm in a faraway land building castles and something else or processing something entirely different. So I say that all to say, like, I definitely understand this idea of getting lost in social media or that noise, like being something that drowns out like the real root of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good image, actually, saying it drowns out like the root of one's thoughts. And that's, at the end of the day, you know, I think it totally has its value, the social media. And for example, I really like being on Instagram and chatting with readers there and seeing their pictures or hearing from them. You know, don't get me wrong, I really love interacting with readers. It's just, at the end of the day, you have music to do and I have books to write. And that should really be the heart of what we do, I would think. And if in times like COVID, where every distraction is welcome, it just becomes unmanageable, then something's got to give, and it can't be the books. And I wouldn't feel too bad about it, because do you remember when Facebook still had this little inbox where you get this little red flag with like a little speech bubble with a 1 or 2 in it if you get a message? So I think they did some studies about the effect of seeing this red little flag pop on your social media on Facebook, and they figured out it had the same level of addictiveness as doing cocaine. And that would kind of dovetail quite nicely with the dopamine burst, because it's also what kind of this does. So it is a serious thing, and we shouldn't feel too bad for protecting our creativity, I think.
I think it's true, because I definitely know that a lot of these social media platforms have done this study, have shown that it is an addicting behavior, and then have ramped it up to make sure that you stay addicted to their platform. So they have. That's why I think I want to say Twitter or somebody was talking about removing the like button on posts, so that to combat that, so they know what it does, and so some of them are for it, some are not. But they definitely, I like to say, they're not adding to my paycheck, so I don't want to add to theirs.
Fair enough.
Oh man. Oh, I have a question. So this is a little bit trickier in historicals, but so there's been a whole lot of talk about diversity of characters these last couple of years in romance. There have been some scandals. There have been some resignations. And I don't know how versed you are in what's going on in romance in the US and that sort of thing. But we're always interested. Every season we try to add a difference of not only race, but sexual pairings, number of pairings in a book, just really diversify our options. And so we're curious in general, how, if you think about that in romance, especially when it comes to ethnicity or race of your characters, what kind of research you do on your characters, if they're coming from, well, obviously I think they are coming from a background different than yours. And just what kind of thought do you put into that in general?
Well, I think that's something that historicals can, include as much diversity as contemporary romance novels. You just have to because, history is not like a monolithic thing, even though it's usually told, at least British history is usually told from the perspective of white, wealthy people. And incidentally, the suffragist movement in Britain really differs from the suffrage movement in the US at one point. And that is that until the Edwardian era, the British suffrage movement was really led by very wealthy or middle-class women, and was also quite white. And in America, I think that was different. I don't know too much about it, but I do know that there was a lot of whitewashing going on. So there's these two differences, I think, between the suffrage movement, and that makes it, for me, made it a bit tricky to include like a suffragist who would also be up at Oxford, who's like a lady of color. Firstly, because if she's like a main character in my squad, I wouldn't feel entitled to tell her story, you know what I mean? And she'd inevitably end up having her own book. But in my third book now, I have a character who's biracial, and she certainly becomes interested in the suffrage movement. So you have to look at history from different angles and where the diversity came in. And it's certainly a challenge to do because you want to get it right. And if you get sensitivity readers, which I do, you mustn't. So what I'm seeing is you can't just look at the sensitivity reader having something to do with the background of the characters that they're looking at. They also need to be well-versed in romance reading, because there's, I think, different expectations maybe in romance readership than regular readership in some ways. So that's something that I'd keep in mind. I find it a bit easier with sexual diversity. For example, Tristan, the hero of my second book, is bisexual, and that just really suited his character because he's inspired from the whole decadent movement and the aesthetics movement, and that was led by Oscar Wilde, who was gay, and quite a few artists in the movement there were upperclassmen who were able, because they were upperclassmen, to get away with that in the Victorian era when you couldn't live that openly, So because it suited Tristan's character, it came very naturally to him. But when
I don't know, it was like bisexual. Tell me more. I haven't read the second one, so I was like,
it's not like something that I explore in depth in Rogue, because it's not like something that is like that's not his journey in that book. He's always loved one person, and that's, I'm spoiling here now, but he's always loved Lucy. So I think he knew that, and he was just very at ease with how he was, also because he moved in these artistic circles. So it wasn't something where he felt like, oh my gosh, what's going on, or where I felt like the need to make it a big issue on the page for him, because for him it's just not an issue, you know. So
nice.
I have is there a question, because now you've done a lot of interviews for your first book and now your second book, is there something that you wish interviewers were asking you about your books? Or
no, not really. I'm always happy to chat, and I hope I'm not getting asked things about what's your favorite book or what's your favorite TV series, because I find it too hard to decide. But I think something that I hope readers take away is from my books that it's always about women negotiating between, you know, being in love and finding or keeping their independence, which is quite a modern thing. But I trust that most readers get that when they read it. So I don't think I have to explain it. No, can't think of anything.
You know what I find interesting when you, as you're talking, is that I think sometimes the education that we were given as women, especially if you grew up in a place where a lot of education was restricted or was like for me specifically, like a biblical based, education on a lot of things about what a woman's job is and what you're supposed to do and that sort of thing. You have this idea that in the past, women were doing the things that you were taught to do, you know? And the more that I have sat down with my mom and talked to her about her mom and talked to her about her grandmother, the more I find out that the line of women I come from, like, didn't give any fucks. Like they were doing, like, I found out that I had, like, my great grandmother divorced my grandfather. I didn't know this because nobody talks about it. Divorced him, and then she was going around town doing whatever she wanted to, and she would come and have like dinner with him every Saturday, and he would take care of her every Saturday and whatever. And my mom expressed like how much he loved her. Like he would take care of her, he would like treat her like a queen and do all this stuff for her every Saturday, and then she'd be off and she'd do whatever she wanted to do, you know. And like the more like the stories that come out, you know, that nobody likes to talk about, like I found out that my like grandfather was abusive, right, to my grandmother. And one day he got drunk and he passed out, and she dragged him outside into the snow and left him out there all night. And that was the last day that he ever raised a hand to her ever. And like, but there's just like these moments that I'm finding out about that, like that just make me feel like, you know, that I've been gaslit in a way where, you know, I'm told like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is how they did it, and your grandmother was so pious, and you only have one view of your grandmother from when you're a little kid, and she was older then, and she was chiller then, and she was, you know, whatever. But that wasn't the case at all. Like they were fighting all sorts of battles. Yeah. Go ahead.
You know, I think what you're saying is super interesting, because that links back to what I was trying to formulate earlier, that history is not a monolith. It's like, you know, on the surface, it might look like one thing, but you always find the interesting thing when you look at individual stories where individuals were always doing things differently. And then you see so many women and also men doing things differently from the norm that you begin to wonder, so who were these masses, or who were the people who kept maintaining the status quo? Because on an individual level, so many people can be like devious and do things their own way, and, you know, carve out a space where they just pushed something forward as individuals. So I think it's totally worth looking at individuals in history and then telling their story, because then you get a fuller picture of those times that we very often think was like the one thing, or things were just like this back then. Also, like in the very beginning, when you said in historical romance novels, you can get away with, like arrogant male behavior more often, and then live out that fantasy. Actually, during my research, I researched suffragist couples, and I found that the men in these relationships, even though this was 1850, were very accommodating, gentle men who had a huge issue with the marriage laws at the time because it gave them power over their wives. You know, the most prominent one probably being John Stuart Mill, who was a British philosopher, and he made a public declaration against marriage laws on the day he married his love, saying, I can't change the laws, but I hate them, and I want to put on record that I'm not going to use these stupid powers. And so even in historical novels, you'd find lots of historically accurate, gentle, supportive men of the women that they married, you know. So it's really a question of pulling out the microscope, I think, and looking at those individual stories and then telling them, and that gives you a much more accurate picture. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to downplay the structural injustice that women have experienced, you know, just because as individuals we can be strong and go against the grain and not live up to these standards. I think it's still important to acknowledge that structurally, or maybe systemic is a better word, we have been at a disadvantage, certainly in the Victorian era, like other minorities, you know, women, queer people have been at a systemic disadvantage, no matter how feisty they were as individuals or how they found spaces to live how they wanted to. You could still get really walloped by the law or by social, mores. And I think it's interesting to keep that in perspective too. Especially, I try that when I write historicals, tell individual stories where the individual can plausibly diverge from that stereotype that we know on the one hand, but also have them run into those rules that existed and made life difficult for them. Because that's how these rules got changed over time by these individuals who were going up against them, you know? But I wouldn't want to take away from their bravery by denying that those obstacles existed.
Yeah, and I like that a lot of the obstacles between the couples in books 1 and 2 are sort of the systemic obstacle. Because a lot of times in romance, it'll be like the main characters are like, I'm like, well, they really shouldn't get married because there's something fundamentally in this relationship that's a problem. And I'm always happy when it's almost more like outside influences or miscommunication is the problem, not so much like incompatibility, and then it miraculously gets solved. And speaking of your books, everyone, Evie is being generous enough to do a giveaway to one of you guys of A Rogue of One's Own. So if you go to the website, romanceataglance.com/Evie-Dunmore, you can check it out, and I will have a link for you to enter the giveaway, and it will be a very exciting time for one of our dear listeners. So thank you so much, Evie.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been an absolute blast.
Absolutely. I get very excited about these. I am very, very, very excited that we got to talk to you today. And I look forward to like reading everything that you publish. And it's cool too, like just FYI, because I mean, we just started our podcast. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And so because you are a newer author, in general, we get to follow you, like, as we grow as podcasters and as we get to follow your journey from the beginning. It's, Julia Quinn has been doing this for a very, very long time, so we don't get to see her growth in the process of anything. So it's actually an exciting thing for me to feel like, oh man, I can grow with an author. And that's, I think, the beauty of all of this. So it's nice. So thank you so much.
Mary, thank you for having me, and hopefully there will be growth. So
there will be growth.
There will be.
There's too much depth in you.
You've been getting all these people saying book 2, including me, is better than book 1. So there's already growth. You're already on your way. And I think it's fun too. We try to do a variety. As Shani said, we try to capture a variety in each season. So established authors, newer authors, independent authors, authors of color, queer authors. We try to go through, and same with all of our characters as well. So it's fun. Speaking of Julia Quinn, we're interviewing her in a couple weeks, but our questions will be different just because she's been publishing for 20 some years now. We don't need to ask how she got her first book published, because it's going to be more about her, catalog.
Yeah.
So it's really been nice I'm happy that you were so candid with us. We appreciate that.
No, totally. And can I ask you a question? Like, how did you find out that you both love romance novels and then decided, let's do something with that? I think that's fascinating because I understand you met at work or...
Oh my God, I will... I'm sure we'll trade off telling you, but so Shawnee is a big fan of babies. And when we met, I was pregnant with my first kid. And I was very pregnant. I was like 8 months pregnant, eating Chick-fil-A and a milkshake at this meeting I went to write I got invited by a mutual friend of ours to help write a spec for her YouTube channel. So basically writing a spec script for this fellowship thing. And it was just one of those moments where you look across the room, you connect eyes with someone, and you're like, "Oh, we're gonna be best friends." Like
it was. Bridget and I have like we have a practical brain, she and I, and so there was like I think 4 of us in the room. We're all friends, but I had just met Bridget that day. That was the first day I'd ever met her, and so they were talking about stuff and their ideas and that. And I think Bridget and I kept saying some practical issues or something. And there was a point in time where I just looked at her, she looked at me, and you just knew, you're like, connected or whatever. And I used to be a postpartum doula. So basically when moms brought home their baby, I teach them the kind of what the process of what bringing home baby means and that sort of thing. And so that's how Bridget and I initially met. And I think I was hanging out at her house one day and she had, I think it was a Black Dagger Brotherhood.
Well, wait, before we get to there, let's tell her about how you didn't even see my first kid for the first 6 months because you had like the bronchitis and flu that wouldn't go away. So every week she was like, still sick, still can't come over.
I would be like, I promise I want to come help with your baby, but I'm still sick. And I'm not going to be that asshole who brings like an illness over your house with your new baby. It turned out that year was like everybody kept getting a never ending flu. That just kept reoccurring. And I thought it was just me and I was a douche. And then it turns out everybody had this like thing. So I felt a little bit better about that. But I kept saying like, I'm coming. I swear I'm coming. So her baby was like 6 months old before like I actually met her or whatnot, the second baby I was there from the beginning and I was like, yeah, from the beginning. And then COVID hit and I missed like the latter half of the 6 months. Or whatever.
So she came over and she was just holding the baby for me all afternoon while I was like, showering and cooking and all those wonderful things that people do while you like someone else hold your baby so you can like take care of yourself. And we were just having lunch and chatting. And I think she said something like, what are you reading or something? I don't remember. One of us brought up books and I was like, oh, I'm reading this romance novel, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, she was trying to be all cool. I like romance novels too. Like, which ones do you read? And I was like, oh, and so I listed like my favorite 10 authors because I am unashamed. I was like, these are my favorite ones. This is what I like to read. I was like, I like this one and this one. And she's like, oh my God, I love that one too. And then we spent the next like 3.5 hours talking about romance novels. And that night, Shawnee called me. And we like typically text, I would say, but Shawnee called me and I was like, hey, what's up? And she's like, so don't say anything yet, but I think that we should start a romance novel podcast. And here are the following reasons. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. Let's do it. And she was like, no. I have a 10-point plan, Bridget. Listen to my argument.
I had made 10 points of how I could convince her to like do a romance podcast. And right off the bat, she was like, I'm in, let's do it. I was like, no, I have 10 points. I took time to write these. I'm gonna tell you these 10 points. Yeah. So then she convinced me again with her 10 points. And I was like, I'm still in. Come over tomorrow and let's figure it out. And then we went to a thing at YouTube Space where they had like Anna Faris's producer come and give a talk with like 3 other panelists and that sort of thing. And afterwards, he was just standing around and we went up to talk to him. And he was like, okay, tell us what your podcast idea is or whatever. And Bridget at the time was going to do like a movie podcast and I was like, okay, I want to do the romance podcast thing. And so we told him that. And then he looked at me, he looked at Bridget and me. He's like, do the romance, do that. And so we were like, all right, well, that seals the deal. Yeah. So then at that point, we just kind of threw ourselves into research. We researched for 8 months, I think, before we put out our first podcast. Like
to see where you fit with your take, or
also to like listen to some other people. But the big thing was like practicing and then deciding like what things we cared about. because like there's so much you could talk about. You could talk about the writing style. Like you could spend a whole podcast only talking about writing style. You could spend a whole podcast only, but we wanted to like, we knew we wanted to cover, you know, like some different, and then just kind of practicing. Like we did a couple where we didn't actually use our first recording. We used that as like, okay, and then we listened back. Okay, here's the things that felt good, and just kind of getting used to our dynamic. And who was going to lead, like who's going to, because there always has to be one person who like leads the conversation and keeps it moving, because we both tend to tangentially wander through life.
We went on so many tangents. So like our podcast in general was about romance novels, but what it's really become over time is relating romance novels to real life situations and relationships. Like, and then what can happen in a romance novel, and if that same thing happens in real life, what that what we think about that and what it looks like, or whatnot. And that just happened naturally as like we just go on tangents. I cut out so many tangents from the podcast that like, because it makes a podcast sometimes 2 hours or just way too long. And then because Bridget and I both come from a production background, we knew that we had to have X amount of episodes in the can before we even put out the first one, because we didn't want to be just like, scrambling to get episodes and that sort of thing. But I honestly couldn't ask for a better partner, because both of us understood production. We both do two totally separate things. Like, so I do the editing of the podcast, and Bridget does more of like more of the writing stuff that needs to happen. And generally, both of us are pretty easygoing in terms of our ideas. So it's like if I have an idea, I throw it at Bridget. She'll refine it and be like, okay, let's do this, or vice versa. We don't fight for ideas we don't care about. We don't, nothing's really like,
we don't even fight for ideas we care about, because honestly, like, to throw it back at Johnny, the best thing is that there's no like competition. A lot of times in a pairing, even a really healthy pairing, there's a natural, like you're like, no, but I like what I said, or I really like that idea. And I feel like both of us, like since the beginning, we talked about it ahead of time, like this has to be very low stress. Like this can't be something where we feel obligated. This has to just be like the funnest thing of our week. And so if someone's like, I don't like that book, we're not going to review it. Or like, oh, I'm not jazzed about that description. We don't even have to know the author. We're just, oh, that description doesn't sound good. Okay, cool. Chopping block, because there are a million books to read. There's a million authors. There's so much stuff to talk about that we like. The only thing we make sure of is that we have diversity within each season, and that each season is a complete sort of idea. And that's it. Everything else is on the table. Everything else is like, just like, she'll be like, I'm not feeling that. And I'm like, okay, cool, let's move on. Or I'll be like, I don't know about that one, Shani. And she's like, all right, let's move. Like, let's not do it then. So it's great.
Yeah. That's awesome. No, I love to hear that. Because I guess one of the few things that I really miss about my actual job is working with awesome women and getting stuff done together. Because writing is so solitary. And, I have an awesome agent and an awesome editor who are women, but it's not the same as you like sitting together once a week,
day in and day out,
doing stuff and having a tangible output, and just so awesome. That's great.
We went before COVID. Shani was at my house 3 or 4 times a week working and playing with my baby, and then COVID happened, and we haven't seen each other since the end of February. And she just got back to LA, so we're hoping her COVID test will be negative so that she could come see us next week, and which will be the most exciting. I agree with you though, because that's the one nice thing about this too, is that I work a solitary, so I work from home. I'm a consultant and writer at my house by myself. I have Google chats with clients and that's it. And Shani is a music producer and video creator. So she's at her house by herself, unless she's like at an event or on set. And so it's nice to have like a mutual project where we can get together, and like even if we're just sitting next to each other or working on separate things, at least we're like together.
Well,
so
there's this one element that I have like kind of pinpointed, right? Because in music production I work with almost all men, right? And generally on sets now I work with mostly women. And I realize that a lot of times when I'm working with men, I hit walls, right? I'm like, oh, I have this idea, and it hits a wall. And usually when I feel like when I'm working with women, if I have an idea, I'm like, how about we try this thing? Most of the time women will be like, let's try it, see what happens. What's the worst that can happen? Or like, so there's this kind of openness to adventure sometimes that I find from women that I don't necessarily, and I'm speaking in generalities, but I much more often hit a wall when I'm working with men than I do with women. There's just a different type of easeability that like I can't really quantify. And so I love that I get to work with Bridget, because it's like I get to speak my native language, I feel like, and it be heard and and embraced sometimes that I don't find in other avenues. I've had to fight much harder in music production and on sets. I've been on sets where my brother has been with me, and he's like a 6'2" tall chocolate with a big afro man. And I've had people walk in and ask him for like the instructions of the day, and him be like, "This is not my set." I'm like, you know, and it's like awkward. So you know, I do find very much so that I enjoy this, and I'm very grateful for this. And sometimes I stop and try to take a moment, like take a beat and take a snapshot, because it's like sometimes I feel like on the come up, you're just grinding. You're like, I wish I can't wait till we get to be big. I can't wait till we get to do this. I can't wait till we have this many viewers or this many listeners or this many whatever. But like we don't get the days back, I feel like, where you know, we just get to be like regular, you know?
It's just a different energy, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
It's just a different energy, sort of energy when you walk into a room, because in automotive and consulting, it's usually 95% men. And in romance writing, it's the other way around. It's 95% women. And there's just a difference in, yeah, as you say, like we have at least I'm wearing a different face for each occasion.
Oh, yeah. Especially as a consultant, I'm sure you feel the same way, where you have to be very like firm. Like, this is my opinion. This is what you should do because you're paying me for my opinion. And they're like, well, what about this? And you're like, no, your opinion is wrong. I have the facts. This is what you're doing, you know? And you have to be much, or at least I find I have to be much more, but
not too ball busting, because that becomes uncomfortable.
No.
So you have to be firm in a schoolmistress kind of way. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. That little teetering line of you know, don't, especially if you come from like backgrounds where there's a lot of machismo, a lot of you know, ego. You're like trying to stroke the ego, but also get what you need done. And that kind of I've been talking about this just with the women in my family for the last, I don't know, month that I was on vacation, that it is exhausting to manage people, right? And when you go to work and you manage people, you're fine. You come home and you need to rest. But when you're managing your husband or your partner or everybody's egos, like, how do you have time and energy for, you know, like, you only have so many fucks to give and so many energy dollars. The idea of having to manage your partner, to me, and as I watched like all these family members manage their partners, I was like, dear God, this is atrocious. Like, I could do a whole nother podcast. So I'm going to leave it right there. But I definitely know exactly what you're talking about, because I extensively just kind of went through a whole thought thread on that topic entirely. But yeah, this is very, very exciting.
Yeah. Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a blast.
Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to our channel to get new episodes, clips, and more.
And click here to watch our previous reviews and author interviews.